All right, let's speak now to SABC News UN correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's joining us live now. Sherwin, a lot of focus on much needed, collaboration, solidarity when it comes to honoring some of the commitments that have been made.
But what does that solidarity look like, Bongi, where it looks like a lot of money? And that's certainly what you hear from people like Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, from people like Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who talks about a $3.9 trillion SDG funding gap, essentially a funding gap in relation to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, that looming deadline, which is 7 years away. So the conversations that are happening here on the margins of the General Assembly, very much about money, financing for development, talking about the commitments that developed economies have made in terms of, for example, the Green Climate Fund, which needs to be capacitated to the tune of $100 billion annually to help developing countries with mitigation and adaptation in relation to climate change. There is a big push from the Secretary General for a $500 billion annual SDG stimulus fund to help developing countries implement the 17 sustainability development goals, because they're lagging, Bongi, where we've talked all week about, only 15% of the targets being met. President Ramaphosa called out developed economies in particular for not meeting their commitments in terms of the official development assistance they have committed to in terms of the 0.7% of their gross national income on an annual basis. So the developing world's posture here is very much, you want us to do these kinds of things. We're not responsible, for example, for what's happening in terms of climate change. So you have to give us the funds so that we can do our part in terms of, meeting these goals. As you have heard from the Secretary General, some 3.3 billion people in the world live in countries where countries pay more on servicing their debt than they do on education and on healthcare. And this is something that world leaders are grappling with in the conversations that they're having here today.
And, Sherwin, it's one thing that, as you listen to even some of what was said by President Cyril Ramaphosa, not only the issue of public finance being critical for development, but also the issues around the coups that we've seen here on the continent, also putting those, targets at risk.
And what people need to understand about coups and conflicts is that it's a vicious circle. The reason some of these coups are happening in places like Niger and in Gabon and in Mali and in Chad and in Sudan is because development is not on par with what the SDGs are calling for. So if people don't have food to eat, if people don't have job security, if people don't have decent work and being able to provide quality education and have access to quality healthcare, then they will celebrate, as we've seen on the streets of places like Niger, these unconstitutional changes in power. And so, the SDGs are very much the blueprint to prevent the very coups that are happening today, because the SDGs are essentially not being implemented. So it's a vicious circle. So the requisite financing is required. We need to deal with the debt burden of some of these developing countries. Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, essentially leading this big multilateral bank, saying, hey, we get it. We understand that the debt burden for some of these countries is too much. And so there's a big push here for a restructuring of debt forgiveness. But also there is a big responsibility now expected in terms of this notion of common but differentiated responsibility. Essentially what that says is we are all responsible for the mitigation and adaptation that needs to happen in terms of climate change, but some of us are less responsible than others. And so developed countries must meet the moment in terms of financing and in terms of reducing that $3.9 trillion deficit, that is dollar deficit, that is required in terms of the requirements in terms of implementing the SDGs. And also part of that is not just public finance, it's the private sector that must come to the party as well. So it's an all hands on deck approach here in terms of the financing that is required to meet these very circular issues, right? Coups, conflicts, but development can get us through there. And that's what I think leaders are trying to focus on here.
And Sherwin, what next is on the cards now? What's expected?
Right, there are a number of other meetings happening. There is a high-level meeting on pandemic preparedness in the aftermath of COVID-19. There is certainly a posture in terms of the multilateral system at the United Nations that there needs to be a global framework in how we mitigate and work towards preventing the next pandemic, which everyone agrees is coming. There is also a meeting this week on universal healthcare coverage. It's a big conversation in terms of the NHI in South Africa, but certainly a conversation that is a global one, not specific to South Africa, but quality health is a sustainable development goal. And so there's a conversation happening on that. And we are expected to speak exclusively with President Ramaphosa at around 8 p.m. South African time to unpack his address to the General Assembly yesterday, but also the interventions he's made on financing for development. He just spoke at a climate summit and really want to have a fulsome discussion also about his interaction with business earlier this week. So we expect that discussion to happen at around 8 p.m. South African time. Things are fluid with the president's schedule, so we'll be able to confirm that once we get final confirmation in the moments ahead.
All right, and we will then await more details, Sherwin, and take it live as soon as it begins. But that is our SABC News UN correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, bringing us the very latest then from the UN General Assembly. And we'll continue to monitor developments around this and also even have some of the analysis in terms of what is coming out from there. I mean, pandemic preparedness is one of the big talking points.